Daniel Bessner, how you doing? Thanks for being here.
I'm good, man. Thanks for having me.
Uh, Last week in Vermont, the Sanders Institute hosted a sort of a big progressive confab, and there was a lot of focus on Medicare for all, on environment, labor, racial justice, the core defining issues of a leftward agenda. But there was also an international component to it. Fernando Haddad, who, of course, leader for the Workers' Party, was there from Brazil. Yanis Varoufakis, the celebrity former Greek finance minister, and they announced this idea of a progressive international, which is really just the idea of having much more kind of communication and coordination between left movements and politicians and potentially governments, like we have at least one down with the inauguration of Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador in Mexico. First, I just want to get your kind of basic take on that move, and what the agenda looks like as far as reforming international, particularly their focus is on reforming international financial institutions, democratizing the EU, and things like that. So let me just start with your kind of broad take on that initiative.
I think it's great, and I think it's finally a breath of fresh air after the post-Cold War era of essentially a dedication to U.S. primacy. It's really heartening to see a mainstream American politician come out on behalf of actually organizing and developing ideas with people who are not based primarily in the United States or amongst the United States' traditional allies. So the questions that remain, I think, are really, what does this mean in actual practice? Should, for example, Bernie win the presidency, what would it mean? And particularly, what does it mean in terms of using the state apparatus for transnational solidarity building, or whether this is more something that would occur at a sub-state transnational level of organization? And going forward, I just think that highlights the importance of the left distinguishing between what might be considered the foreign policy of the state, using state apparatuses like the military, the State Department, et cetera, and the foreign policy of civil society, using the grassroots organizations that really transcend national boundaries, and how a political leader like Bernie could work between those. But otherwise, it's a fantastic first step towards making a better world, and the world that we'd like to actually live in.
We're going to go basically kind of region by region and continent by continent. But before we get there, speaking directly to your point, you have actually said you have a critique of left-wing foreign policy thinking that we grew up with and sort of predominated since the people, of course, rightfully dissenting about what I would deem to be, frankly, essentially American genocide in Vietnam and in Laos and Cambodia. Right. But you have a critique of what has defined the left foreign policy tradition of the past since Vietnam. What's that critique, and what's the alternative you're proposing?
Sure. So I think the critique is essentially not actually on the substance of a lot of the criticisms of American imperialism and the awful American actions in Vietnam, and of course, elsewhere throughout the world, as you just discussed a couple of days ago with what George H.W. Bush did as head of the CIA and in Nicaragua with regards to Contras and pardoning everyone. So there's a lot of horror to go around, and I think that the critiques of that were very good. My problem is only that the generation of leftists that were politicized during and after the Vietnam War oftentimes have had more of a critiquing function than any actual pretensions to governance. So looking back, of course, hindsight's 2020, but looking back, I think it would have been useful for what might call the Chomsky generation to have developed counter institutions of American foreign policy that would have developed plans and ideas and really almost ideologies for what the United States could do to actually make the world less organized around American hegemony and to make the world a more just place. I think for a variety of reasons, particularly Watergate and the Watergate scandals, led many leftists, understandably, again, to be very skeptical of using state power for any positive ends, and particularly the horrors of the Soviet Union as it continued to wind down also made people skeptical of state power. and therefore many leftists just disassociated themselves from governance. But I think what we see now in 2018 is that this actually isn't the most effective way to enact the policies and create the world that you want to see. So what we need to do is develop mechanisms in which people who are ensconced in institutions, what might be left-wing institutions, are actually connected to the grassroots as well. So we're able to have this recirculation process where elites are able to channel grassroots ideas and desires into policy programs that are able to be implemented at the state level.
And I think it's really interesting because you're actually creating, I think in my mind, this kind of a hybrid, because you're critiquing the sort of exiting of the potential of harnessing those institutions for a radically different way of doing global policy, and one that, centers civil society, one that's built around sharing, solving collective problems of the environmental crisis, global inequality, rampant corporate abuse and power, the tradition, and well as breaking up U.S. hegemony and foreign policy, the traditional concerns of anybody with a conscience on the left. And so you're saying, like, we could use and take over these state institutions to harness and empower civil society in those networks. And what's interesting to me is that, those networks were built in things like solidarity with Latin America in the 80s against Reagan's support of death squads and dictatorships. It was built in, the way the ANC had a global strategy to harness civil society, particularly in Europe and the United States, to apply sanctions to the South African regime. So there's some of what you're talking about and building on already exists, but you're saying, what if the positionality wasn't just always on the outside?
Yes, that's exactly right. And I do also want to emphasize that this is just the short-term goal. The medium-term goal would be to really reform these institutions fundamentally,
right,
to make them substantially more democratic, like the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, the CIA, and the military are all really fundamental institutions. And it's more about recognizing, in the classic Marxian sense, what moment in history you're actually living in. And your history and you're actually living into your advantage. And I'm not saying that these are great institutions by any means. In an ideal world, I think they would probably mostly be taken down and maximally, and at the very least, significantly reformed so that they would be unrecognizable. But it's just the question of what do we do, today? The way that I phrase it is, how do we stop a drone strike tomorrow? That's a different question and requires a different answer than how do we totally reform the national security state. And I think both are worthy goals, and just we as lefties need to really have different time horizons and change our strategies accordingly to those different horizons.
100%. So let's start going region by region. Let's focus first here with U.S. policy towards its neighbors, primarily the Caribbean and Latin America, but we could also tack on the trade issue by including, Canada and these supposed renegotiations of NAFTA that we saw. So I'll break it into two parts. One part is, today there's obviously a resurgent far right taking power across most of Latin America, with the obvious major exception of Mexico and a couple of people hanging on in Bolivia and Uruguay. But Argentina, Chile, and now, of course, with Bolsonaro coming in Brazil, there's this extreme far-right axis. And then obviously Venezuela is not in that far-right axis either, although I wouldn't at this point exactly call it. We need to defend Venezuela from U.S. intervention, but I would not exactly call it really a member of the left in some ways right now. But that might be another conversation. And John Bolton is embracing these governments. There is a very serious danger of, as an example, U.S. military intervention or coup in Venezuela. And there's also, the sort of reorientation back towards another kind of mass unmitigated, U.S. corporate plunder of its neighbors. So actually, let's get to NAFTA second. What's the step right now from this, left foreign policy perspective of reorienting the Caribbean and Latin America?
Sure. Well, I think as probably many of the listeners will know, I think a lot of the problems in the U.S. and Latin American relationship just stem from the fact of colonialism, 500-year-old colonialism, in which nations of the North Atlantic and what's commonly considered the West just rapaciously, essentially demolished these societies through a variety of measures and means. So first of all, it's not just important to recognize that history as a moral issue, which is important in some sense, but also to recognize it as sort of the deep historical structures that we're dealing with. So this is a region of the world that the United States has increasingly and forever really perverted in a variety of ways. So the question that I see is how does one develop a non-hierarchical relationship where the Caribbean and Latin America is not just essentially used for U.S. purposes, both economic purposes and sort of the extraction of resources, and also political purposes, as it was during the Cold War and the War on Terror, when the United States variously supported right-wing regimes and demonized the left. So the question is, what does a left-wing in power left-wing movement in power do with that reality? So I think the fundamental thing that you have to do is reorganize the hierarchical material economic relationships that exist between the regions, develop some means of not rapaciously extracting resources. And this would, I think, have a lot of problems. Like many of our foreign policy problems, also has a lot to do with changing domestic culture at home. So I think if we have a consumer capitalism centered on the individualist consumer, it's going to be very difficult to rearrange these hierarchical relationships. So what we have to do is really reconceive about how Americans view the very act of consumption for which they have taken so much from Latin America. So that would really be a first step. I think a second step would be doing things like building solidarities, or at least being vocally against something like the imprisonment of Lula, which I know you've talked a lot about, and that right. to be very vocal that the United States is not going to allow the imprisonment or not going to allow. I see this is difficult because then you get into these imperial relationships,
right.
but at least allows
right.
not the right term,
right.
but that the United States it will come out publicly and strongly against actions like that. And that really, I think what's important here is that, like you said, you don't want the American state to really do things, but you do want leftist movements within the United States to build transnational solidarity. So I think in this instance, you'd really want to obviously renegotiate trade deals and things along those lines to make them less awful for Latin America, but also to focus at the sub-state level about working with leftists on the ground in places like Brazil who really know the territory and terrain, and helping them with the privileged position that Americans find themselves in, and that American leftists find themselves in just by virtue of living in the metropole of the empire. And so using the resources we have on a grassroots level in Latin America, and really at a sub-state level, because you don't want, in my opinion, at least the American state to get deeply involved in the region, because in the future, when there's a right-wing president, that will allow for a lot of very awful things to happen. So you also need to be aware of the limits of the state to do what it wants in this particular area of the world.
What about the NAFTA question specifically?
Well, I basically... because this also relates to the whole Angela Nagel controversy about open borders, right? And I think it's a really difficult question, because you don't want to limit the American leftist imagination due to some basically capitulating to the borders created by capital. So how do you adopt a dual-pronged program where you, on one hand, help American workers and then don't turn your back, which I think we absolutely shouldn't do on the migrants who are often migrating here, because the United States has totally destabilized their region of the world for literally centuries and continues to do so. So I think that's the sort of policy that you want to focus on, a have your cake and eat it too policy, because I think in the world in which we live in, there are, in fact, enough resources to politically distribute to both American workers and the refugees who are coming here for just and important reasons. And I'm personally more of an open borders person, that we should be allowed to come to the United States to come. So I think you'd want to renegotiate
Daniel,
NAFTA.
I'm sorry, you cut out for a second. Can you restate that? Because I think that's really interesting. You are sort of a proponent, as I would be, in sort of like almost like a social EU model in Latin America, the Caribbean, Canada, and the United States, which would mean along with all of these other dynamics we're addressing with labor, the environment, and breaking down the hierarchy, a much more sort of open, borders-oriented, kind of transnational stance, if I understand you correctly.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And the way that's my biggest long-term foreign policy goals is creating like a true EU but democratic organization, at least in North America, if not including Central and South America. And the question for us is how do we do that without reimposing U.S. hierarchy on it, right? Where it's not like the dollar is the reserve currency and then everything has to be pegged to what the United States does. And I think that's a really important question that our generation of leftists could examine going forward.
Definitely. All right. So then we're going to keep going here. Europe.
Yeah. And so this is really an interesting one because this is the one that all the people who promote the liberal international order always point to. And I think it's important for leftists to understand that the end of great power war in Europe is probably the greatest accomplishment of the order that the world order that the United States set up after 1945.
Definitely.
So I think the question we have to ask is how do we as leftists both should we again win power and just at a sub-state level help contribute to the ending of a great power war in Europe? And I think what's important to do is to recognize that first, this is probably unlikely given the culture that's developed over the last 70 years. But we also need to think about ways in which leftists, both in and out of state, could encourage the democratization of the EU, both in terms of its politics and also in terms of its economics. I think what the European Union has demonstrated, beyond the shadow of a doubt, is that an anti-democratic political structure will never receive this type of mass public support it needs to survive. So I think that's the big lesson of the EU since the early 1990s. So the question is, how do we reform that institution to make it more democratic? How do we encourage the acceptance of even more refugees in Europe as currently accepted now? And of course, the United States could be much better about that. And how do we ensure that great power war doesn't continue into the future? So what's happening now is France and Germany are trying to sort of create a Central European power bloc to balance against the United Kingdom on one side and Russia on the other. So what does the United States do, right? And particularly, what does the United States do with regards to NATO? I tend to think, and you may very well disagree, reasonable people could disagree, is that the United States probably no longer continues to have a serious military presence in Europe and should basically stop funding NATO and leave it up to the local people there to decide, while all the same trying to encourage Europe through a variety of diplomatic measures to make the EU more democratic and to accept more refugees.
Yeah, and this is actually where, as an example, like, things that I wouldn't normally be particularly excited about, but I also, again, we are in our specific historical moment. I think there should be a real radical transformation, winding down of what NATO is. But then on the other hand, that actually makes certain things, like when a guy like Macron, who I really could not have more contempt for, talks about like a common European defense policy. That's the type of actually intermediary step that's going to be necessary to unwind these sort of larger imperial alliances you're talking about. So that actually is important there, in my opinion.
Right. I agree completely. And so the way is, how do you do this sort of technical thing in the short term without losing sight of the medium and long-term goals, which is really, dismantle borders, dismantle the military, and things along those lines. And just to put a final button on it, the United States should obviously not encroach on Russia's territory, basically sovereign territory of interest. And then there's larger questions about what you do with a country like Ukraine, but that might be for another discussion.
Okay.